The wind had teeth that night. It scraped across the frozen fields of Karelia, dragging snow in long white veils between the black skeletons of the pine trees. The temperature had fallen so low that exposed skin froze in seconds. Breath crystallized in front of faces and fell like dust. Somewhere out in that frozen silence, a man lay face down in the snow, motionless. From a distance, you would have sworn there was nothing there. Just a smooth, untouched blanket of white. But inside that snowbank, wrapped in a homemade winter camouflage suit, a short, compact Finnish farmer was watching. His name was Simo Häyhä. The Soviets would learn another name for him: White Death. For hours he hadn't moved more than a finger. His rifle rested on a small mound of packed snow, carefully built up with gloved hands exactly as high as he needed. He had pressed snow into his mouth to keep his breath from steaming in the air. He had wiped every bit of oil from the metal of his gun so the cold wouldn't congeal it. He had even refused to use a scope runner because glass could fog, and worse, it could catch sunlight and flash like a signal mirror. He wanted to be invisible. Ahead of him, across a white killing field close to 400 meters wide, Soviet soldiers were moving, dark dots crawling across the snow, struggling through drifts in their dark green uniforms, like flies smeared onto a white plate. Many of them could not even imagine there was a man lying out there in that kind of cold, waiting for them. They had been told they were marching to crush a tiny country in a matter of days. They had been told that Finnish resistance would collapse under the weight of Stalin's tanks and guns. Instead, one by one, the men at the front of their column began to fall. No warning, no sound at first, but the dull flop of a body hitting the snow. Then another body, and another. By the time they heard the delayed, distant crack of the rifle, the White Death had already reloaded, adjusted, and found his next target. In a war of 1 million shells, 1 million shouts, and 1 million blunders, this was something else. This was personal. A frozen duel between one man and an army. And this is his story. To understand who that man was when he lay out there in the snow, we have to go back decades to a Finland that barely existed as a country. At the start of the 20th century, Finland wasn't independent. It was a grand duchy under the Russian Empire, a cold, distant province ruled from St. Petersburg. For generations, Finnish farmers and hunters lived close to the land, speaking their own language in wooden houses, paying taxes to a distant czar they would never see. Simo was born into that world in December 1905 in the village of Rautjärvi, not far from the Russian border. He grew up in a family of 8 children in a small farmhouse surrounded by fields and forest. There was no electricity, no running water, no central heating. Life was simple and hard. You worked, or you went hungry. He was small even as a boy, shorter than many of the other kids. That might have mattered in a city schoolyard, but not so much in a village where your worth was measured by how well you could harvest, carry, and fix things, and whether your hands knew what to do when something broke. From an early age, he learned 2 things that would later define his life: how to work and how to shoot. In a place where the growing season was short and winters were long and dark, hunting was not a hobby. It was part of survival. Simo learned to track rabbits, birds, foxes, and elk. He learned to read faint marks in the snow, broken twigs, and the way fresh powder lay on an old footprint. He learned that in the forest you move when the wind moves and you wait when the forest is still. A rifle for him was just a tool, like an axe or a saw. You took care of it, you knew its quirks, and you didn't waste bullets. Every shot had to count. Missed shots meant no meat on the table. Those quiet lessons taken in cold mornings and long evenings didn't look like military training, but they were. When Simo was 12, the world he knew caught fire. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed in revolution. Out of that chaos, Finland seized its chance and declared independence. But freedom didn't arrive cleanly wrapped with a ribbon. The new country immediately fell into a brutal civil war between whites and reds, conservatives and socialists, city poor and rural elites, neighbors and neighbors. Villages burned, families were split. Men who had never left their province found themselves marching under flags and shooting at people who spoke the same language. Simo was too young to fight in that war, but he saw the aftermath. He saw the bitterness. He saw what it meant for a small nation to be caught between big forces and how fragile independence could be. When the smoke cleared and Finland began to build itself as a republic, there was a quiet feeling in the background of everything. We are on our own. No empire is coming to save us. If we want to stay a country, we will have to be ready to fight for it. In his late teens and early 20s, Simo did what most young men in his world did. He worked on the farm. He hunted. He attended Lutheran church on Sundays. He joined the local civil guard, a kind of volunteer militia that provided basic military training and, crucially, a place to shoot. The civil guard ranges became his second home. Imagine a snowy field, a line of rough wooden shooting stands and metal plates or paper targets set up at various distances. Now picture a small, quiet young man, seemingly unremarkable, calmly reloading and firing as other men joked and chatted. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he just hit, over and over again. Stories from those days tell of him hitting coin-sized targets at 150 meters 16 times in under a minute in cold weather. Whether every detail is exactly right isn't so important. What matters is the pattern. In competition after competition, his name rose to the top. He turned up, lay down, and calmly shot better than almost anyone else. The mental wiring of a sniper was already there. Patience, discipline, absolute focus under pressure. He didn't know it yet, neither did his country. But the skills he'd learned shooting for prizes and for meat would soon be all that stood between him and a steamroller. That steamroller was gathering speed just across the border. In the 1930s, Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with a fist of iron and paranoia. He had purged his own officer corps, sending thousands of experienced commanders to prison camps or firing squads. At the same time, he was obsessed with security, with buffer zones, protective belts of territory that could keep enemies away from key Soviet cities. One city in particular bothered him. Leningrad, the old imperial capital, sat only about 30 kilometers from the Finnish border. On a map, that looked like a dagger pointed at the Soviet heart. Stalin tried to negotiate. He demanded that Finland move its border further away, give up stretches of land near the Karelian Isthmus, and lease bases for Soviet troops. For Finns, who had only been independent for 20 years, the demands felt like slow strangulation. Some politicians argued for compromise. Others said, if we give up now, we'll end up giving up everything. Talks dragged on. Both sides misread each other. The Soviets thought Finland, tiny and isolated, would eventually cave. The Finns thought the Soviets were bluffing. They weren't. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet artillery opened up all along the border. Columns of tanks and tens of thousands of infantry rolled forward. Soviet aircraft bombed Helsinki and other cities. The Winter War had begun. On paper, the mismatch was absurd. The Soviet Union had around 170 million people. Finland had about 3.7 million. The Red Army could throw hundreds of thousands of troops into the fight. It had thousands of tanks and aircraft. Finland had a handful of tanks and an air force so small that it could barely cover its own cities. But paper doesn't show forests. Paper doesn't show snow. And paper doesn't show men like Simo. When the call went out, Simo, now in his 30s, reported for duty as a reservist. He wasn't a high-ranking officer. He wasn't part of some elite sniper unit. There was no such thing yet. He was just another soldier assigned to the 34th Infantry Regiment, fighting along the Kola River in Ladoga, Karelia, north of Lake Ladoga. If you look at a map, Kola is just a line through wilderness. If you stand there in winter, it's a frozen river winding through dense forest and low hills, a landscape of snow, rock, and trees. In December 1939, that strip of land became a legend. The Soviets attacked with overwhelming force. At points, Finnish units held against odds of 10-1. Every hill, every bend in the river, every clump of trees became a contested position. Somewhere in that chaos, Simo took his rifle, pulled his white camouflage over his uniform, and went out into the snow. Let's look at that rifle because it mattered. Simo's weapon was a Finnish-modified Mosin Nagant M28-30. It fired a 7.62-meter cartridge. It was a bolt-action rifle. You fired a shot, worked the bolt manually to eject the spent case, chambered the next round and fired again. No semi-automatic fire, no spray of bullets, just deliberate, controlled shots. Crucially, he used iron sights, not a scope. Most people today, thinking of snipers, picture big optics with crosshairs and zoom. Simo didn't like them. Scopes sat higher on the rifle and forced him to raise his head a little more when firing, making his silhouette just that bit bigger. In winter sunlight, a lens could catch a stray ray and reflect it, betraying his position in a flash of light. Scopes were also more likely to fog or freeze. Iron sights were simpler, tougher, and lower. He trusted his eyes. For closer fighting, he carried a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun, a heavy drum-fed weapon that spat 9mm bullets at close range. With that in his hands, he fought not like a distant sniper, but like any other infantryman, firing short, brutal bursts in ambushes and patrols. But when he went out alone or with a spotter, he took the rifle, and he went to work. Picture one of those days. The sky is the color of old steel. Snow squeaks under boots. The air is so cold it feels sharp in the lungs. Simo and another soldier, his spotter and guard, move on skis between trees, white capes blurring their outlines. They move along routes they've already scouted, staying behind ridges, ducking into hollowed-out areas of snow. They reach a vantage point overlooking a clearing the Soviets have been using. Maybe a stretch of frozen marsh, maybe a gap between two belts of forest. Simo tests the snow with his poles and finds a shallow depression. They begin to build a firing position. He doesn't dig a deep foxhole. That would take too long and make too much disturbance. Instead, he shapes the snow, building a low mound to support his rifle, tamping it down carefully so it won't collapse under recoil. He packs snow around the muzzle area so the first shot won't send a fountain of loose powder into the air, giving him away. He lies down on his stomach. The first full contact between his body and the ground is like a shock. The heat leaches away immediately. Even through layers of wool and cotton, the cold seeps into bones. He adjusts his scarf and the cloth over his face so that when he breathes out, no visible vapor escapes. Sometimes he puts a bit of snow in his mouth to cool his breath further. His spotter settles a little behind and to the side, eyes scanning with binoculars, rifle across his lap as security. And then, they wait. This is where most people would fail. It's one thing to lie in the snow for a few minutes while someone takes your photo. It's another to lie there for hours, not moving, not stretching, not scratching an itch. Listening to your own heartbeat and the small ticking sounds your muscles make as they tremble. Time seems to slow down, then dissolve. But Simo was built for this. His whole life had trained him to be comfortable in stillness. Long hours hunting, waiting for a fox to appear near a snare or a bird to land on a branch. Long winters on the farm when there were only a few hours of light and endless time to listen to the creak of wood and the whisper of snow on windows. He watched. A jay flitted between branches. Somewhere far off, artillery boomed, dull and distant. Closer, the brittle crunch of boots on snow. Soviet infantry. At first they appeared as ghosts between the trees. Dark coats, fur hats, rifles slung, breath steaming. They stepped out into the clearing, some in a loose formation, some straggling. Maybe they were moving up to relieve another unit. Maybe they were probing the finish lines. Maybe they were lost and just trying to follow the last set of tracks. It didn't matter. For Simo, they were targets. But he didn't rush. He watched their movements, looking for pattern. Who was in charge? Who was pointing, giving orders? Who carried the radio? Who looked more alert, scanning the tree line? Kill those first and the rest would hesitate. He chose his first target, led him slightly to account for the way he walked, exhaled halfway and squeezed the trigger. The crack was flat and sharp in the cold air. The man jerked and fell. For a second, nothing happened. Then the others reacted, some dropping, some shouting, some running in different directions. Simo worked the bolt smoothly and took his next shot. Another man fell. Within moments, the clearing was chaos. Some Soviets fired blindly into the tree line. Others tried to drag wounded comrades. Some, driven by training and fear, tried to press forward. It didn't matter. Simo kept firing, changing targets, staying calm, counting his shots. When things got too hot, or when the Soviets began to lob mortars or heavy machine gun fire into the trees, he and his spotter would melt back into the forest, shifting to a different position, ready to do it again later. Now multiply this scene across days and weeks. Now imagine that instead of one ambush, there are dozens. Instead of 5 kills, there are 50. Instead of uncertain accuracy, there is a growing, horrifying pattern. Every time Soviet infantry try to move in that sector, men die from invisible bullets. By Finnish records, Simo's first confirmed kill as a sniper came in early December 1939. As the winter deepened, his tally climbed relentlessly. On some days, he killed just a few. On others, like the famous day where he is said to have killed 25 men, he turned stretches of snow into charnel grounds. The way kills were counted wasn't casual. The Finnish army required confirmation, either from an observer who saw the target fall, or from inspection afterward when positions changed hands and bodies were found where he'd said they'd be. If more than one sniper shot at the same target, that kill wasn't credited. Kills made with his submachine gun were not added to his sniper tally. Under those rules, he reached a number that sounds unreal. More than 500 confirmed kills by sniper rifle in less than 100 days of combat. Some sources say 505, others push it over 520. Some wartime diaries mention around 259 by early March, plus a similar number with the Suomi and closer fights. Whatever the exact figure, all agree he was the single most lethal sniper of the war, and probably of any war, in terms of confirmed enemy soldiers killed. For the Soviet infantry facing him, he was not a statistic. He was a rumor with teeth. They began to whisper about a Finnish sniper who could see in blizzards, who never missed, who hit men at distances and in conditions where no one should be able to shoot. They gave him a name, Belaya Smrt, White Death. What did that feel like from the other side? Imagine you're a Soviet conscript, 19 years old, pulled from a village in Ukraine or a factory in Leningrad and sent north. Your officers told you this would be quick. The Finns were few, poorly armed, class enemies who would fold under the might of the Red Army. Then you get there. The cold is like nothing you've known. Your boots are thin. Your coat is barely enough. Your rifle sometimes freezes. You stand in long, exposed columns on narrow forest roads while shells burst around you. And as you trudge forward, men in your unit begin falling. Not from artillery, not from visible machine guns, just falling. A man beside you jerks, a neat dark hole suddenly in his chest. Another drops to his knees, grabbing at his throat. You hit the snow, heart slamming, eyes scanning the tree line. You see nothing. Your officer shouts at you to get up, to keep moving, to stop panic. All you can think is, the trees are watching me. That's the psychological weight of a sniper like Simo. A machine gun might pin you, artillery might terrify you, but a sniper gets inside your head. Every step could be your last. The Soviets tried to fight back with their own snipers. They brought in trained marksmen. They tried to set counter-sniper traps, placing decoy helmets, watching for muzzle flashes, scanning likely perches. According to some accounts, Simo found himself in duels, watching, waiting, feeling another unseen hunter somewhere out there. One story tells of him realizing a Soviet sniper had taken a position in a tree to get a better view. That, he thought, was a mistake. Trees are high, but they sway. A man in a tree is exposed against the sky, his outline more obvious than he might think. Simo watched for the faintest movement, caught a tiny silhouette, and put a bullet through it. The enemy sniper fell, breaking branches on the way down. Whether that exact duel happened just like that or not, the point is clear. It became harder and harder to send anyone with rank or experience into Simo's sector and expect them to come back. In one of the darker ironies, the more the Soviets tried to send skilled snipers to neutralize him, the more skilled men they lost. While all this was happening on the micro level, one man, one rifle, one patch of forest, the wider war around him was grinding on in blood and frost. The Winter War wasn't just a sniper show. It was a brutal contest of artillery, infantry, and the environment itself. Finnish ski troops cut Soviet columns into pieces. Small teams slid silently through the forest, hit supply convoys, and disappeared. They used a tactic called moti, isolating pockets of enemy troops like logs chopped and stacked, then reducing them bit by bit with hit-and-run attacks rather than trying to smash entire divisions head-on. The Soviet command, hampered by Stalin's earlier purges and by rigid doctrine, kept feeding men and machines into the same choke points. At Kola, where Simo fought, the line held against repeated assaults. A Finnish colonel, when asked, "Will Kola hold?" famously replied, "Kola will hold unless we run away." That gallows humor captured the mixture of despair and stubbornness at the front. In that cauldron, Simo's work became one vital thread in a larger fabric of resistance. He wasn't winning the war alone, but in his sector he was making the cost of every Soviet step brutal. The legend grew. News of a sniper with hundreds of kills spread along the Finnish lines. Chaplains noted his tally in diaries. Officers began to mention him in speeches to boost morale. If one man from Rautjärvi can do this, we can hold. At some point, he received a special rifle as a gift from his commander in recognition of his effectiveness. He also began to get leave from frontline duty now and then, dragged back from the snow to be held up as an example, to rest, and then sent out again. If you look at photos of him from that time, you don't see a swaggering hero. You see a compact man with a round face, wearing a winter cap, eyes slightly narrowed, expression neutral. He doesn't look like death. He looks like any quiet, practical farmer. And yet, the nickname stuck. White Death. What did killing that many people do to him? Simo himself rarely talked about it. After the war, he was famously laconic. He once said, when asked if he felt remorse, that he did what he was told, what he was good at, and what he had to do for his country. That's not a confession, and it's not quite a boast. It's a statement from someone who compartmentalized. We can't crawl into his mind and be sure what he felt lying awake at night. We can guess. Any human who has watched that many people fall because of their trigger finger carries something heavy. But in the moment, in the Winter War, there wasn't much space for philosophy. He had a job. And then, the war hit back. On March 6, 1940, with the Winter War in its final days, Simo's luck ran out. By then, the Soviets had brought in more experienced commanders, reorganized and concentrated artillery to hammer Finnish lines. The pressure at Kola ramped up. Simo wasn't just sniping, he was also fighting with his submachine gun, leading or joining small counterattacks to plug gaps. That day, he was in the front line, crouched among trees and snow, firing on advancing Soviets. Somewhere out there, a Soviet marksman had also been watching. He might have seen the puff of snow from Simo's muzzle. He might have seen a flicker of movement when Simo shifted position. He squeezed his own trigger. The bullet that hit Simo was an explosive round. It smashed into his lower face, tearing through his upper jaw and cheek, blowing away a large portion of his jawbone and teeth. His comrades later recalled that his face seemed to disappear in a spray of blood and bone. He fell back unconscious, horrifically wounded. At first, those around him thought he was dead. He was carried away from the front and placed on a pile of corpses. Hours later, someone noticed his leg twitch. They dragged him off the death pile and rushed him toward surgical care. He was still alive, but barely. For days, he hovered between worlds. Surgeons fought to stabilize him. In an era without modern reconstructive techniques, in field hospitals under strain, their options were limited. They cleaned out bone fragments, tried to control infection, bandaged what they could. He slipped into a coma. On March 13th, he woke up. The first thing he learned when he could understand words again was this: the war was over. That very day, Finland had signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. The Winter War had lasted 105 days. Finland had been forced to give up about 10% of its territory, including Simo's home village region, to the Soviet Union. But it had survived as a sovereign state. The Soviets had taken horrifying casualties. Estimates range from over 100,000 dead to far more, depending on the source. They had paid dearly for every kilometer. Simo had given everything he had. He had lost half his face. He had lost his home. He had survived. Recovery took years. If you've ever seen the photographs of him after surgery, you can see the cost. His lower face is heavily scarred, his jawline uneven, his mouth twisted. He had to learn to eat and speak again with a rebuilt jaw, to live with pain and with the knowledge that he would never blend in as easily as before. At one point, rumors of his death had circulated. Newspapers had printed obituaries, comrades had mourned him. When he recovered enough to read, he saw reports of his own demise. He reportedly wrote to correct them. The White Death was not quite dead yet. The war, unfortunately, was not really over either. In 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Finland, angered by its losses and seeking to regain territories, entered what it would call the Continuation War, aligning with Germany against the USSR. Simo, ever the soldier, asked to return to the front. The army said no. His injuries were too severe. His face and jaw were not just cosmetic issues. They affected his ability to live in the field, to eat, to endure the physical strain of combat. He was kept away from the lines. For a man whose identity had become fused with that winter on the Kola front, being benched was its own kind of wound. He returned instead to what he had known before the war: farming, forests, and dogs. When peace finally came to Finland for good in 1945, the country had been scarred twice over. It had fought 2 wars against the same giant neighbor, lost territory, and buried tens of thousands of its young. But it was still independent. In the Cold War that followed, it walked a careful path between East and West, a policy later dubbed Finlandization. Simo settled into a quiet life. He hunted. He bred dogs. He visited shooting ranges. Occasionally, he attended veterans' gatherings where younger men would inevitably gape at the legendary sniper in their midst. He didn't act like a celebrity. He didn't write a best-selling autobiography. For decades, his name was known mainly in Finland and among serious military historians. In his village, he was just Simo, An old man walking through the woods with his rifle and his dog. But the legend of the White Death never completely faded. It sat there like a story told too late at night, waiting for someone to pick it up. In the late 20th century, as interest in sniper history grew and works on World War II and the Winter War were translated into more languages, his tally of 500,000 kills began to appear in articles and books. Comparisons were made. Vasily Zaitsev at Stalingrad, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the Lady Death of the Red Army, Carlos Hathcock in Vietnam, modern snipers in Iraq and Afghanistan. In that company, Simo's numbers stood out. He wasn't just one of many, he was the top of the list. Some people reacted with awe, others with skepticism. Could one man really have killed that many in just 100 days? The more historians cross-checked Finnish records, chaplain diaries, and after-action reports, the more the core of the story held. The exact number might be debated. The fact that he was devastatingly effective was not. In his later years, journalists finally began to sit him down and ask him about it. What did he remember? How did he feel? He gave short answers. He said he just did his duty. He said that given what had happened to his country, invasion, bombardment, loss of land, he did what needed to be done. He didn't talk much about specific shots or particular days. In private conversations, he sometimes returned to simpler topics. The quality of different rifles, the pleasures of hunting with good dogs, the changing of seasons in the forest. On his farm, he kept a modest life. No trophies on the wall screaming White Death. Just the ordinary clutter of a man who had lived a long time and made peace as best he could with what he'd seen. He died in 2002 at the age of 96. He had outlived almost everyone he shot at. He had outlived the Soviet Union itself. So what do we actually do with a story like this? It's tempting to turn him into an icon. On the internet, you can find his face on posters, on t-shirts, and video game references. 500 kills. White Death OP. Lines like that strip away everything but the kill count. On the other side, you can also find people eager to condemn him in simple terms. Mass murderer. Cold-blooded killer. Both reactions are flat. Real human beings are not that one-dimensional. So let's put some depth back into the picture. First, strip away the myth and you find a pattern that repeats in many wars. A quiet, rural man extraordinarily skilled at something, shooting, tracking, reading terrain, is pulled into a conflict he didn't choose. In the pressure cooker of battle, that skill becomes lethal. Officers notice. They push him harder because he is effective. He becomes a symbol. Does he change inside? Yes. Does he stop being human? No. Simo wasn't born with White Death stamped on his forehead. He was a kid feeding chickens and chopping wood. History, geography, and politics put him between a giant and his home. He chose to fight. Second, look at context. The Winter War wasn't a symmetric, noble duel. A huge dictatorship invaded a tiny democracy. The invader had more of almost everything, except common sense about terrain and climate, and except local knowledge. The defender used every advantage it had. If you were finished then, watching Soviet artillery plow up your villages, watching bombs fall on Helsinki, watching reports of brutal actions in border towns, you weren't counting kills like points in a game. You were counting the days your country was still free. Does that justify everything? No. But it explains why, for Finns, Simo isn't a horror. He's a defender. Third, think about what his story says about war itself. We like to imagine wars are won by big things, tanks, bombers, generals in elaborate uniforms drawing arrows on maps. But often they're shaped as much by small, cold moments. A farmer lying in snow for 6 hours waiting to squeeze a trigger once. A 19-year-old conscript hesitating to cross an open field because he's heard stories of a ghost in white. A commander choosing to send men around a sector instead of through it because casualties there have been mysteriously high. Those micro decisions repeated thousands of times changed the macro picture. The Winter War was not decided by Simo alone, but his presence tilted the local odds in favor of the side trying to survive. Fourth, look at the cost. He took faces, bodies, and futures from hundreds of Soviet families. He gave his face to the war in return. He spent the rest of his life taking his meals with a jaw rebuilt by surgeons who did their best under the limitations of their time. He carried scars others couldn't see, even if he never admitted to nightmares, even if he insisted he just slept fine. Behind every confirmed kill is an echo. War stories tend to follow the echo that fits our side's narrative. They rarely talk about the ones on the other side. When we talk about White Death, we should remember the men he killed were not cardboard enemies. They were as human as he was, caught in a different machine. And finally, notice what happened afterwards. He did not turn into a professional killer. He did not wander the world looking for somewhere else to aim his rifle. He went home. He raised dogs. He tended land. He shot animals for food or for culling, not for sport and not for training to kill people again. You could argue he went back to normal, or you could argue that there is no fully normal after you've lived through what he did. But he tried, and the country he fought for, one winter, one rifle, one patch of forest at a time, went on to become one of the most stable, prosperous democracies in Europe. The border he lay near is still there. The flag he wore is still flying. That, more than his kill count, is the real measure of what he bought with those frozen hours in the snow. If you travel to the old Kola front today, you can walk paths where soldiers dug their foxholes and built their dugouts. There are memorials and plaques, a small museum. In winter, the snow still falls. The river still freezes. The trees still whisper in the wind. Stand there for a moment. Close your eyes. Listen. You can almost hear the distant thump of artillery, the crack of rifles, the crunch of boots. You can picture a short man in a white suit lying absolutely still in the snow, watching shapes move against the tree line. You can see a group of Soviet soldiers hunched against the cold, unaware they've stepped into the sights of someone who knows this land better than they ever will. You can feel faintly the tension in the air just before a trigger breaks. And you can ask yourself the questions that hang over every story like this. What would I have done if my home was on that side of the line? What would I have done if I'd been ordered to cross into that forest on the other? There are no easy answers. There is just the image of a man who, for one brutal winter, became the sharpest edge of his country's will to live. They said no one could kill at 400 meters in a blizzard. For 100 days in 1939 and 1940 on a frozen river line called Kola, a quiet farmer named Simo Häyhä proved them wrong, and then spent the rest of his long life trying to simply be a man again, not a legend.